Okay, here's the second lecture of this Friday, March 20th, predator-prey relationships. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to finish talking about this Lotka-Volterra model. And then we'll move on to the snowshoe hare and the lynx, and then a little about optimal foraging theory. Well, like a lot of models that are supposed to be applied to natural settings or natural populations, there's a number of assumptions with this Lotka-Volterra model, and oftentimes they don't hold up under scrutiny of looking at actual populations, wild populations. So one of the assumptions is that for the predator population, at least, that the birth rate is of the predators, which is going to influence the predator population growth, that the birth rate is directly related to the prey availability or the prey population. That one more prey in the population, one more prey that can potentially be eaten, translates to a certain increase in the reproduction of the predators. Now, whether that's true or not might not be the case. There's certainly other things that limit reproduction. There's mates, there's nesting sites, and there's predator avoidance. There's a lot of things that go into influencing the reproductive success of the population of predators. So this assumption that there's a linear relationship, one more prey translates to a certain level of increase in reproduction of the predator population. That's what the assumption is. It's not necessarily true. The other thing, in terms of the predator population, is that the rate of predation is constant. That one more prey means a certain amount of food, a certain amount of predatory success by the predators. And that's not necessarily true either. We're seeing right now the influence of density dependence on the population. Now, viruses aren't alive, but this whole social distancing and having classes online, not having meetings of more than 10 people, all these different things that we're dealing with now are related to density dependent in humans. The fact that we transmit diseases when the density of humans increases. But there's this assumption, the Lotka-Volterra model, that one more prey means a constant or the increase in food, predatory success is the same for the predator. And that's not necessarily true either. One more prey does not necessarily translate to one particular unit of predatory success. Well, let's look at some of the limits of this. Let's look at this predation term, for instance. You'd think maybe that there might be a linear relationship between prey and predation success. That one more prey means an equal amount of predatory success. But that's not necessarily the case, because maybe there's a bunch of hiding places, and it's only when the prey population gets above the level at which there's no more places to hide, or there's a limited number of hiding places, then the prey become even more available because they can't hide. They're exposed. They're easier for the predator, so it's certainly not going to be a linear increase. Or maybe, on the other hand, when the population is going down, the prey population is going down. At some point, there's no place to hide, so the ones that can't find a place to hide, they're easy to catch for the prey, for predators. The prey are easy to catch because they don't have a place to hide. But let's say there's 100 hiding places, and the prey population is 150. There's 50 prey that don't have any place to hide. They're easy pickings. Easy to prey upon. When you get to 100 individuals, every one of those prey has a place to hide, and now it's not so easy for a predator to find a prey. There's also learning that takes place with predators, learning how to capture the prey, and maybe to begin with they're not very wise, they're not very experienced at catching prey, but the more they encounter them, the more success they have. And you can only eat a certain amount. Those tiger sharks that I showed eating the albatross, they come there in the morning, they eat 2 or 3 birds. They're as big as a turkey, so it's like eating 2 turkeys. You get full, and so even though there's more prey out there, they're not necessarily going to eat them. But you can look at this list, and you can get an idea of what some of the problems are with the assumptions that go into the Lotka-Volterra model. Even though it's not a perfect model, and even though some of these relationships might not follow exactly along, it still makes sense for the most part in terms of prey affecting the predators, predators affecting the prey in terms of their populations. So we're going to look at this at a specific example of this, where this Lotka-Volterra model was applied for a long time, and in the end, you know what? We found out, ecologists found out that it's not so simple. There's a lot of interactions that species are involved with, and we're going to look at the snowshoe hare and the lynx. And there are certainly species that are interacting heavily with one another. Lynx feed primarily on snowshoe hares. And snowshoe hares, one of their major predators are the lynx. So there's certainly the lynx population is affecting the hare population, and the snowshoe hare population is affecting the lynx population, but it wasn't, as it turned out, it wasn't this clear-cut, oh, look, there's the Lotka-Volterra model in action in the wild. That's what we're going to see, that it wasn't such a simple case, because these things are involved in a lot of interactions, not just with each other. So this is this very classic study where they looked at the population of a predator and the population of prey. And the idea was, oh, look, here's a prey population that's being affected by the predators. Here's a predator population that's being affected by the prey. It's a very good example of this predator-prey interactions, and it's a very good example of this Lotka-Volterra model in action. And so there's a number of different different aspects of this relationship that make it especially applicable to this Lotka-Volterra model. One is that they really do interact quite a bit. The snowshoe hare are preyed upon to a very large degree by lynx, and lynx prey very heavily on snowshoe hare. So that's one thing. There's a lot of predators out there that don't have a prey like the snowshoe hare. They don't have one species that they prey on almost exclusively. There's some species that are like that, but a lot of predators, they eat 2 or 3, 5, 16 different things. So they're not necessarily going to have their population influenced by the population of one prey. They're going to be influenced by a number of prey. The other thing is that there were long-term records that enabled scientists to be able to estimate what the populations were. Now, for most wild populations, you have no idea what the population is. Population estimates are hard to come by. And there's some populations where the estimates are pretty good, but they haven't been going on for that long. This was a case where there were fur trappers that kept records, and they had access to these records. There were some pretty good records for over 100 years, 150 years or so, of how many lynx were caught in these traps and how many snowshoe hare were caught in these traps. And the presumption is that the number of lynx that were caught by trappers reflected the lynx population. The higher the lynx population, the more lynx were caught in this trapping. The effort was similar amongst years. And the same thing for the snowshoe hare. The more snowshoe hare there were, then the more were caught in traps. And the lower the snowshoe hare population was, the fewer were caught in traps. So you could just look at the number of animals caught in traps by all these different trappers up in Canada and get an idea, at least a proxy, for what the lynx population was and what the hare population was. So when people looked at this trend over time, they saw this delay, this lag of the predator population behind the prey population. So if you look at this figure, it's not so cyclical and even like that figure that we looked at before, but there's a peak in the green and then there's a peak in the red, and the red peak is delayed slightly behind the peak in the green. So you got a peak in the snowshoe hare followed by a peak in the lynx. Peak in the snowshoe hare followed by a peak in the lynx. And it was fairly consistent enough where people were saying, oh, look, there's this Lacca-Volterra type of relationship. The lynx population goes up, and that drives the hare population down because they're being preyed upon. The prey population goes down, so the lynx population goes down because they don't have as much energy to channel towards reproduction. Now the lynx population is low, so the hare population goes up because there's not as much predation. Now the hare population is up, so the predator population goes up, and around it goes for the cycle over all this time that this was being monitored for this 60 years or so, 70 years. Long-term data. And as I said, there's not that many populations that have been monitored for that long. Well, let's look at this. That is a lynx. You know what this lynx is doing, of course, it's looking for a snowshoe hare. There's the snowshoe hare. Now you'd think that this lynx would be extinct with the predator capabilities like that, not being able to capture the hare. But these hare, they're pretty fast, they're pretty agile, they can get away. The snow is pretty deep, so it's not the easiest thing for the lynx to capture this snowshoe hare. And who knows what they did to make this video in the first place. But this shows this predator-prey relationship pretty well. Let's watch this for a minute. So you think, oh, the snowshoe hare, it's going to get away, it's going to get away. Right behind it, it's not giving up, it's got to go. The lynx is thinking, where is that? Grab it. Now it's over there. How did it get over there? Remember, this is a TV show, so obviously good at catching the snowshoe hare. You think, oh, it's caught it, it's killed it, it's going to eat it.
We humans hate to see a cute little bunny caught and killed. But the snowshoe hare is not as helpless as it might appear.
They like to show that on TV, so they say, oh, look, the rabbit got away, the hare got away. I actually survived. And people feel so bad watching this TV show. But, you know that the snowshoe hare get caught and killed by the lynx. The lynx is just trying to find someone to eat. They're certainly better predators than this one in the video. Some of the time. So it's quite a dynamic predator-prey relationship. This lynx and snowshoe hare. Alright, now I'm tired. I didn't even catch it. Well, as I said, the original thought was that the lynx are regulating the snowshoe hare population. The snowshoe hare population is regulating the lynx population, and you have this around and around it goes. And so originally, though, even before the people started looking at this Lotka-Volterra model, the thought was there were a number of different explanations for this trend. People were aware of this data and this cyclical population fluctuation for the snowshoe hare and the lynx, and they were aware that snowshoe hare were fed on very heavily by lynx, and that lynx fed very heavily on snowshoe hares. There were a number of different explanations for that to begin with. So one of the first thoughts was, you know what explains this cycle? They look at this fluctuations in the snowshoe hare and the lynx, and what is it? It looks like it's about 10 years. If you went back and looked at that graph that shows the population fluctuation happening on about a 10-year cycle. So originally they thought, oh, well, you know what the explanation is? It's sunlight, the amount of sunlight there is in a year. There's a good year, and then there's 9 years that aren't so good. That's the explanation for the photosynthesis and the food of the hare, since they're herbivores, and that increases, and then the hare population goes up, followed by the lynx population. That was the explanation. Then there was this idea floated around that it was overpopulation, that it was just the hare population reached a certain level beyond its carrying capacity, and then it went back down. And the same thing for the lynx, that they weren't necessarily so related to one another, but each one was being affected by the other one. In terms of some of the prey population changes were resulted from the effects of predation, but there were a lot of other things. Disease and stress, starvation, part of it. And then eventually people became aware of this Lotka-Volterra model and this mathematical representation of the effects of a predator population on a prey population and prey population on a predator population, and this idea of going back and forth and density-dependent population regulation related to this predator-prey interactions. So that was eventually became what everybody thought was the explanation for this. So how does this work then? Well, one of the ideas is that you can look at who's influencing who the most. Is it the lynx that are influencing the hare, or the hare that are influencing lynx? Now look, there's a lynx that caught a hare. That goes on a lot. They just don't like to show it so much on TV shows. But the idea was that the real driver in this relationship, certainly they're affecting each other, but the real driver was the lynx, and that the lynx were exhibiting top-down population control of the hare population. That the lynx would regulate the hare population by basically decreasing the number of individuals in the hare population, by eating them, by preying upon them. And that's how this whole thing worked, that it was mostly the lynx that were driving this relationship, and most important. Well, the opposite side of this argument is that it's not the lynx so much, but it's the hare. The hare population is more important. It's the hare population that's influencing lynx population to a greater degree, and it's bottom-up control as opposed to top-down control. The reality is that they're both influencing each other to a certain degree, and as we'll see in a minute, it's not even related so much to the hare or the lynx. Those aren't the primary factors that are fluctuating over this 10-year time interval. So what is it that explains this cycle that you see in the hare, snowshoe hare, and the lynx population? There were a number of different hypotheses thrown out there: sunlight and top-down control, bottom-up control. As people looked at this in more and more detail, one thing that became apparent is that the hare relationship, not with the lynx, but with the food that they were eating, the snowshoe hare's food, the plants that they were eating, there was a relationship there. And it's not so much a predator-prey type of interaction, although it is, but not in the classic sense that we think of as like a lynx eating a hare, but in the hare eating plants. Because what would happen is that the plant population, the plants have these secondary compounds, these toxins. And as the level of herbivory, the amount of plants that were being eaten, the amount to which the plants were being fed on, as that increased, then the amount of toxins, these secondary compounds that they produced, increased. So as a result of increased herbivory, these plants were producing more secondary compounds to combat increased herbivory. That influenced the nutritional content and the ability of the hares to feed on these plants. And so there was less food for the hare. Less food means less energy channeled towards reproduction. So the hare population would go down. As the hare population went down, then the lynx population went down, because there was less food for the lynx. Now, certainly the lynx are contributing to the fluctuations in the hare population, but it wasn't the lynx preying so heavily on the hare that was driving the hare population down. And it wasn't the reduction of predation by lynx that was so much the explanation for the hare population going up. It was this 10-year cycle in the amount of secondary compounds that were in these plants. That's what fluctuated 10 years, and that's what influenced the hare population, and that's what influenced the lynx population. And one of the pieces of evidence was that there were places where there were hare, but there were no lynx. There were no lynx, but there were hare. So this predator-prey relationship didn't exist the same way that it did other places. And so when they examined the fluctuations in this hare population over time, they found that the hare population went up and down in the absence of lynx, just like it did places where there were lynx. And so the explanation obviously wasn't lynx preying on the hare, because there weren't even any lynx on this island to influence the hare population. So there must be another explanation besides the lynx. And as it was, when they looked at these secondary compounds in plants, that they increased at a regular cycle. 10 years, a big increase in the secondary compounds. Then the hare population declined. The amount of herbivory was eased. And then the concentration of these secondary compounds decreased. And then the hare population went back up. And that was the explanation for this cycling. There weren't even any lynx, and yet the hare population was fluctuating in a similar manner as hare populations did where there were lynx. So it's more the plants and the hare that are explaining this fluctuation than the snowshoe hare and the lynx. Certainly the lynx are influencing the snowshoe hare population. Certainly the snowshoe hare population is influencing the lynx. So, there's this very simple explanation that the snowshoe hare are being eaten by the lynx. The snowshoe hare population goes down and goes up. But look at this figure. You see all these different arrows. These are the type of interactions that are taking place for the snowshoe hare. They're competing with these different species that feed on some of the same plants that they do. They're feeding on these different plants that are developing these secondary compounds that are reducing the amount of herbivory, and then they're being fed on. Sure, there's the lynx up there that eats a lot of snowshoe hare, but they're eaten by coyotes, and they're eaten by owls and eagles and hawks. And so this idea that there's this one prey population that's being affected by predator population, this was a good example here with the heavy predation on snowshoe hare by lynx. But this diagram shows you all the different interactions, how complex the hare role or niche in its ecosystem actually is. So they've got predators, they've got prey. In this case, the prey is actually a plant that they're eating because they're herbivores. So there's a multi-dimensional level of interactions that are ultimately influencing the hare population over time. If you look at the lynx, now the lynx population, this is what's going on with the lynx population, is that they are not influenced so much by predators. Maybe they have a few predators, but the lynx is feeding on snowshoe hare and birds, these different types of birds, especially in squirrels, rodents. And so the lynx is at the top of this food web, and the lynx also has a number of different interactions with. They're competing with different predators that are also feeding on those, and they're interacting with their various prey, feeding on different types of prey. Now, the arrow from the snowshoe hare to the lynx might be really, really strong because that's their major prey. But it's more of a two-dimensional relationship for the lynx between their prey and their population. So in this case, the hare population is probably influencing the lynx population to a greater degree. The hare population is certainly being influenced by the lynx population, but the hare population is being influenced by a variety of factors. Okay, then I think that is enough for this lecture. This is about close to 30 minutes, so this will be more than 50 minutes for this. Then on Monday's lecture, we can finish up this predator-prey relationship topics, and we can move on to symbiosis.